The morning it happened, the weather app on Carter Ellison's phone read 107 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time he lost consciousness on the side of that road, it had climbed to 109. And by the time Marisol Reyes knelt beside him in the dirt and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, searching for a pulse that she was terrified she wouldn't find, the asphalt beneath him was hot enough to cook an egg. Not figuratively. Literally. The ground temperature on Arizona blacktop in peak summer sun routinely exceeds 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a fact. And Carter was lying on it. 14 years old, dressed in a $200 t-shirt, alone on a road that nobody used on Saturday mornings except ranchers and the occasional lost tourist. No signal. No water left. No help anywhere on the horizon. His skin was the color of old brick, red and dry, not a drop of sweat on him, and that detail, that one specific detail, was what told Marisol everything she needed to know. Because when the human body stops sweating in extreme heat, it is not recovering. It is surrendering. The cooling system has failed. The organs are next. She had learned that from her grandmother at age 10, standing in a dirt yard watching Elena treat a collapsed construction worker while the rest of the adults stood in a circle and panicked. Marisol had not panicked then. She did not panic now. She set down her water jugs, pushed her hair back from her face, and got to work. Nobody sent her. Nobody trained her. Nobody paid her. She was 12 years old, barefoot, and she was the only thing standing between a boy she had never met and a death that would have destroyed 2 families and quietly indicted every single person who had driven past him that morning without stopping. This is not a story about miracles. It is a story about what happens when one person refuses to look away. And it begins, as the most important stories often do, long before the moment everyone remembers. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Douglas Ellison was born in Flagstaff, Arizona, the second of 3 sons raised by a father who ran a hardware store and a mother who kept the books. He was not born into money. He was born into the particular American combination of moderate scarcity and enormous ambition, the kind of upbringing that teaches a boy, very early, that comfort is not guaranteed and that the only reliable path to security is relentless, uninterrupted work. He had internalized that lesson so completely, so permanently, that by the time he was 38 years old and his company, Ellison Medical Supply, was distributing pharmaceutical equipment across 11 states, he had almost no memory of how to stop. His office in Phoenix was on the 14th floor of a building with floor-to-ceiling windows, and on a clear day you could see the mountains from his desk. People who visited him there said it was a remarkable view. Douglas Ellison rarely looked up from his screen long enough to see it. He had married at 32, a woman named Patricia, a corporate attorney from Tempe who matched him in ambition and precision and who understood, going in, that she was not marrying a man who would be home for dinner most nights. They had been well suited for each other in the way that 2 very high-functioning, very driven people can be well suited, compatible in temperament, aligned in goals, genuinely fond of each other but not built for the kind of slow, unhurried intimacy that long marriages require. Carter was born when Douglas was 34, and the birth of his son produced in Douglas something he had not expected, a fierce, almost overwhelming love that he had absolutely no idea what to do with. He held Carter in the delivery room and felt the full weight of the responsibility of it, and his response to that weight was the only response he had ever learned: he worked harder. He told himself he was building something for his son. Something stable. Something lasting. Something Carter would inherit and be grateful for. He told himself this so convincingly, and so consistently, that he never stopped to notice that what Carter actually wanted was not a company. It was his father's attention. Patricia and Douglas separated when Carter was 9, quietly and without significant drama, in the way that 2 people who are fundamentally decent but fundamentally incompatible eventually acknowledge what they have both known for some time. The separation was handled by lawyers, which suited both of them. Carter split his time between his mother's house in Tempe and his father's house in Scottsdale. His mother was warmer, more present, more likely to ask him how he was actually feeling and then sit with the answer. His father was more likely to ask how school was going and then answer his phone in the middle of Carter's response. Carter loved them both. He needed them differently. And as he moved through his early teenage years, 12, 13, 14, he began to feel, in the specific and wordless way that adolescent boys feel things they cannot name, that something in his life was fundamentally hollow. That behind all the comfort and the private school and the brand new everything and the driver who took him places, there was a kind of quiet emptiness that he had never been given the tools to describe or address. He was not a troubled kid. That is important to say clearly. He was not acting out. He was not failing school or picking fights or making dangerous choices in the ways that some kids do when something is wrong beneath the surface. He was, by every external measure, fine. He was fine in the way that a house is fine when the foundation is cracking, everything on the surface looks normal, the lights are on, the windows are clean, but underneath, something essential is shifting. The sneaking out started 6 months before that Saturday. The first time, he had taken the car out at 6:45 a.m. On a Saturday morning, driven 40 minutes into the desert, parked on the shoulder of an empty road, and just sat there for an hour listening to the silence. No schedule. No agenda. No one asking anything of him. He had felt, in that hour, more like himself than he had felt in months. He had driven back before anyone was awake and slipped the keys back onto the hook in the garage and gone upstairs and slept until noon. He did it again the following Saturday. And the one after that. By the 5th Saturday, it had become a ritual, the 1 hour of the week that belonged entirely to him. He had not told anyone. Not his mother, not his best friend from school, not the therapist his mother had suggested he see twice a month and who he was reasonably honest with about most things. This one thing he kept private. Not out of shame. Out of the knowledge that if he described it to anyone, they would want to understand it, and understanding it would require explaining it, and he could not explain it. He just knew that he needed it. The 5th Saturday was June 14th. The tire blew out at 8:23 in the morning, 43 miles from his father's house, on a stretch of road with no signal, no buildings, and a sun that had been climbing since 6 and showed absolutely no mercy. Now let's talk about Marisol. Because to understand what she did on that road, you have to understand who she was before she got there. And to understand who she was, you have to understand Elena. Elena Reyes was 71 years old when this story takes place. She was born in a small town in Sonora, Mexico, the granddaughter of a woman who was known throughout the region as someone you called when the doctor was too far away or too expensive or both, which, in that place and that time, was most of the time. Elena had grown up watching her grandmother work. Watching her assess a situation with her eyes and her hands before she ever said a word. Watching her stay calm in rooms full of fear and uncertainty, not because she was unafraid, but because she understood that calm was a skill, not a feeling, and that in a crisis, the most important thing one person can give another is steadiness. Elena had carried that knowledge across a border, through decades of hard work, through a marriage and a widowing and the raising of children and eventually grandchildren, and she had never once let it go. She had also never let herself believe that it was less valuable because it came without a degree attached to it. What Elena knew, she had earned through observation and practice and necessity, and it had saved lives. That was not an abstraction. That was a fact she carried quietly and without pride, the way you carry something that belongs to the world more than it belongs to you. Marisol's mother, Elena's daughter, Rosa, had been a difficult, restless person who loved her children in the urgent, inconsistent way of someone who was simultaneously running from something and searching for something and had never been able to figure out which was more important. She had left when Marisol was 7 and her younger siblings, Daniel and Grace, were 5 and 3. She had said she needed time. She had not come back. Elena had taken all 3 children into her house on a Tuesday morning, fed them breakfast, and from that day forward had simply proceeded as though this was the arrangement and the arrangement was fine. She did not dramatize it. She did not allow the children to feel abandoned, not because she hid the truth from them, but because she filled the space so completely and so warmly that abandonment didn't have room to settle in and take root. By the time Marisol was 12, her grandmother was the most important person in her world. Not the most important adult. The most important person. The one whose judgment she trusted above anyone else's. The one whose voice she heard in her own head when she had to make a decision. Elena had taught Marisol to read the desert the way some grandmothers teach their granddaughters to read recipes, with patience, with repetition, with the understanding that knowledge only becomes useful when it becomes instinct. She had taught her which plants held water. She had taught her how to find shade when there was no obvious shelter. She had taught her the difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke, because in their community, in Arizona, in the summer, that distinction was not academic. It was survival. She had taught her to check breathing first, then pulse, then skin condition. She had taught her that the back of the neck and the inner wrist and the armpits and the groin area were where the body's blood vessels ran closest to the surface, and that cooling those points first was the fastest way to bring a body's core temperature down when you had no ice and no equipment and no time. She had taught her all of this the way Elena's grandmother had taught Elena, not in formal lessons, not with textbooks, but in the moments when it mattered. Beside a sick neighbor. At the edge of a construction site in August. In the kitchen at midnight when one of the little ones had a fever that scared them. Marisol had absorbed every word. She was the kind of child who does not simply memorize information but integrates it, who takes what she learns and turns it into a part of how she sees and moves through the world. Her science teacher at school, a quietly passionate man named Mr. Aguirre, had told Elena at a parent-teacher meeting in April that Marisol was the most naturally analytical student he had taught in 15 years. She doesn't just answer the question, he had said. She wants to understand why the answer is what it is. And then she wants to know what happens next. Elena had nodded and said, yes. That's been going on for a while. On the morning of June 14th, Marisol left the house at 7:10 a.m. to make the water run. This was not unusual. This was a Saturday morning like any other Saturday morning. She carried 2 empty plastic jugs, one in each hand, and she wore her worn-out sneakers for the walk out and took them off at the gate of the well to save the sols, the way Elena had taught her, carrying them the rest of the way in one hand. The walk back, with the full jugs, took longer. She was methodical about it, stopping every quarter mile to set the jugs down and stretch her hands, the way Elena had shown her to prevent muscle cramps in the heat. She was on the last stretch, about a mile from home, when she came around a long, slow curve in the road and saw the black Suburban parked at an angle on the shoulder. She saw the blown tire immediately. She saw the open doors. And then she saw Carter. He was on the ground on the passenger side of the car, half in the shadow of the open door, half in full sun, and he was not moving. Marisol set her jugs down on the road, in the shade of the car's shadow, and she ran. She knelt beside him and did the assessment exactly as Elena had taught her. Airway, his mouth was slightly open, no obstruction. Breathing, shallow but present, she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest. Pulse, she pressed 2 fingers to the carotid artery in his neck and counted. It was there. It was weak. It was fast, too fast, which meant his heart was working overtime trying to compensate for what his body was losing. Skin, she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead the way Elena always did, and then to his forearm, and then to his chest. Hot. Dry. No sweat at all. She checked the time on the small, scratched-up watch she wore on her left wrist. It was 8:51 a.m. She looked around the inside of the open car. A half-empty bottle of water on the floor of the passenger seat, she uncapped it and put it aside. An emergency kit in the open back hatch, she grabbed it. Inside, a silver reflective emergency blanket, a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, a pair of gloves, a flashlight. She put the gloves on. She took stock. She had 2 gallons of water in her jugs. She had the emergency blanket. She had the half bottle of water from the car. She had her hands and what she knew. She thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then she began. She used the water from the car bottle first, pouring it slowly over his neck and face, avoiding his mouth. She unfolded the emergency blanket and used the reflective side facing out, fanning air across his damp skin. She tore a strip from the bottom of her own shirt, the loose cotton hem, and wetted it with water from her jug, then folded it carefully and pressed it to the back of his neck, directly over the vertebrae, where the blood ran close. She checked his pulse again. Still there. Still fast. She elevated his feet, propping his heels on the lower edge of the open car door frame, to encourage blood flow back toward his heart. She talked to him. Not loudly, quietly, steadily, the way you talk to someone who is somewhere between sleep and gone and you want to anchor them to the world on your side. "You're okay," she said. "I've got you. Stay here." She did not know his name. She did not know who his father was. She did not know that the car beneath whose door she was sheltering him cost more than her grandmother's house. None of that was relevant information in this moment. The relevant information was his pulse, his skin temperature, his breathing rate, and what she had available to work with. She checked his pulse every 5 minutes. She kept fanning. She kept the cloth on his neck wet. She talked to him. 22 minutes after Marisol arrived at the scene, a blue pickup truck came down the road from the east. It slowed and then stopped. The driver's door opened and a man in his 60s climbed out, broad-shouldered, tanned, wearing a wide-brimmed hat against the sun. His name was Roy Hendricks, and he had been ranching this stretch of desert for 30 years and had driven this particular road every single Saturday morning for most of those 30 years. He had seen a great many things on this road. He had never seen this. He stood at the edge of the road and looked at the boy on the ground and the girl crouched over him with a silver blanket and a wet strip of cloth, working with the focused quiet of someone who is not confused about what they are doing. "Is he alive?" Roy said. "Yes," Marisol said, without looking up. "His pulse is there but it's fast. He's in heatstroke. Do you have signal on your phone?" Roy pulled out his phone. "1 bar, barely, the kind of bar that comes and goes with the wind." "I might," he said. "Try to call 911, Marisol said. "Tell them heatstroke, unconscious, and give them your GPS coordinates from the map app. Don't try to describe the road, just give them the numbers." Roy stared at her for a half second, then nodded and stepped away from the car, moving until his phone found the thin edge of signal and holding perfectly still. He got through. The call dropped twice. He called back twice. By the 3rd call, he had given dispatch everything they needed. 26 minutes, they said. Roy came back. He looked at the girl, still working, still steady, and something shifted in the set of his face. "You know what you're doing," he said. It was not a question. "My grandmother taught me," Marisol said. Roy Hendricks went to his truck and came back with his cooler. He had ice inside it, the kind he brought to his ranch hands on Saturday workdays, packed in a foam cooler with drinks and a bag of sandwiches. He set it beside Marisol without being asked. She looked at the ice. She looked at Carter. She packed handfuls of ice into the first aid kit's bandage cloths, wrapping them carefully so the ice was insulated enough not to cause skin damage, and she placed them with precision, under his armpits, behind his knees, against the sides of his neck, in the crease of each elbow. These are the arterial pressure points, the locations where major blood vessels run nearest to the skin's surface. Cooling them is the fastest way to bring down a body's core temperature from the outside. This is not folk wisdom. This is what emergency medical protocols recommend. Roy Hendricks stood beside her and watched and did not say a word. He handed her things when she reached. He checked his phone for signal. He stayed. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story all the way through, because what happens next changes everything. The paramedic unit arrived in 24 minutes, 2 minutes faster than dispatch had estimated, because the lead medic, a woman named Diane Castillo who had run emergency calls in Pima County for 11 years, pushed the speed when the call described an unconscious juvenile with heatstroke in full sun. Diane had worked 3 fatal heatstroke calls in her career. She knew what the numbers looked like when you arrived too late. She did not intend to arrive too late. When the unit came around the bend and she saw the scene, the SUV, the girl, the boy on the ground, the older man standing by, she registered several things very quickly. The boy was in a recovery-friendly position. His feet were elevated. There were ice packs at his major pressure points. There was a wet cloth on the back of his neck. Someone had done everything right. She was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. She knelt beside Carter and began her assessment, speaking quickly and efficiently. She looked up at Marisol. "How long has he been down?" "I found him at 8:51, Marisol said. "It's 9:14 now." "What did you apply first?" "Water from his car bottle to the neck and face. Then the cloth, it's my shirt hem, to the back of his neck. Then the ice when the man brought the cooler. Armpits, inner elbows, back of the knees, sides of the neck." Diane looked at her partner, Marcus, who was setting up the monitoring equipment. He gave a small nod that meant, she did it right. Diane took Carter's temperature with the ear thermometer. 104.7 degrees Fahrenheit. She kept her expression even. That was high, dangerously high, but it was survivable with proper intervention, and the intervention that had already been applied had, in her professional estimation, bought him time that he would not otherwise have had. She looked at Marisol again. "How old are you?" Marisol told her. Diane nodded. She did not smile, she was working, this was not a moment for smiling, but there was something in the brief, direct look she gave Marisol before she turned back to Carter that carried more weight than most compliments do. It was the look of one person who takes their work seriously acknowledging another person who takes their work seriously. It crossed the distance between 41 years and 12 years without any condescension at all. They loaded Carter into the unit. His pulse was stronger than it had been, the cooling measures had begun to have effect, his body starting to come back from the edge it had been standing on. He was still unconscious. Marcus drove. Diane worked on him in the back, for line in, continuous monitoring, cold saline to bring the internal temperature down in coordination with the external cooling already begun. As they pulled away, Roy Hendricks stood beside Marisol on the road. The silver emergency blanket was folded on the ground. The ice cooler sat open, half empty. The 2 water jugs, the ones she had started out with that morning, full of water for her grandmother's house, were nearly empty too. She had used almost all of it. She stood on the side of that road and watched the ambulance disappear around the curve, and for the first time since she had set her jugs down and run toward a stranger, she felt her legs shake. Just slightly. Just once. Then she bent down, picked up her jugs, and started walking home. She did not tell Elena what had happened on the road in a dramatic way. She came through the door, put the jugs down, lighter than they should have been, and said, "Abuela, I used most of the water. I had to." There was a boy. Elena looked at her. She looked at the empty jugs. She looked at the torn hem of Marisol's shirt. She did not ask a flurry of questions. She filled a glass of cold water and handed it to Marisol and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and she let Marisol tell it in her own order, in her own time, from beginning to end. When Marisol finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were folded on the table. Her eyes were on her granddaughter's face. "Did you do everything the way I showed you?" she asked. "Yes," Marisol said. "All of it?" "All of it." Elena nodded. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Marisol's. "Good girl," she said. That was all. But coming from Elena, it was enough. It was more than enough. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Douglas Ellison's Saturday had gone the way his Saturdays usually went. He was in his home office by 7, reviewing a supplier contract that his legal team had flagged on Friday afternoon. His phone was on silent. He silenced it during work hours, including weekends, because he had found that if he didn't, the interruptions compounded until nothing got done. His housekeeper, Margaret, arrived at 9 as usual and made breakfast that he ate at his desk while reading the contract. At 11:30, he sent 3 emails and started a 4th. At 12:15, Margaret knocked on his office door. She rarely did this, and the fact that she was doing it now registered with him as unusual before she had said a single word. He looked up. Her face told him the rest. Carter's school had an emergency contact system, and when the hospital in Tucson had admitted an unconscious minor in a vehicle registered to Douglas Ellison, the system had activated within 90 minutes of Carter's arrival. The call went first to Patricia, Carter's mother, who was visiting her sister in San Diego that weekend. Patricia's voice, when Margaret relayed the message, was the kind of voice that belongs to a person trying very hard to stay functional in a moment when everything in their body is telling them to stop functioning. She had called Douglas directly, not through the messaging system, not through his assistant, but his personal cell, which she still had from their marriage and which he answered on the second ring because it was Patricia's number and Patricia did not call him on his personal cell except in emergencies. She said, "Carter is in the hospital in Tucson. He collapsed on the road. Heat stroke. He's alive." And then she said, "Douglas, your car was missing from the garage. He took your car." Douglas Ellison had not said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be there in 2 hours," and he hung up and stood up, and for the first time in a very long time, he left his office without finishing what he was working on. He drove himself. He had a car service he used for almost everything: airport runs, client dinners, late-night returns from the office. He did not wait for them today. He got in the car himself, in the clothes he had been wearing all morning, without his jacket, without his briefcase, and he drove south toward Tucson on the I-10 with his hands tight on the wheel and his eyes on the road. He was not someone who processed things emotionally in the moment. He processed them later, in the quiet, when the urgency had passed and he had time to sit with what things meant. But in the car, driving toward his son, the processing arrived early and all at once, and it was not comfortable. He thought about the fishing trip, the one time, when Carter was 6, that he had taken him to a lake outside Flagstaff and they had spent an afternoon doing nothing but sitting in a boat with rods in the water. He had not planned to be present for it in the way he ended up being. He had been planning, in the back of his mind, to answer emails when Carter wasn't looking. But something about the quiet of the water, the weight of the rod, his son's small focused face as he watched the line, something had made him put the phone in the tackle box. And they had spent 4 hours on that water and caught 3 fish, all of which they threw back, and his son had laughed every time a fish was released, that clean, uncalculated laugh of a 6-year-old who finds the world genuinely funny. He had not reproduced that afternoon. Not once in 8 years. He had told himself there would be time. He had told himself a great many things about time. He arrived at the hospital at 4:47 p.m. He parked in the structure at a diagonal across 2 spaces, which he would not have done on any other day of his life, and he did not go back to fix it. He was at the elevator before he had finished locking the car. He found Carter in the ICU ward, in a bed with an 4 running saline, his skin pale and his eyes half open, the monitors beside him producing a steady and reassuring rhythm that Douglas stared at for a full 30 seconds before he was able to move. He crossed the room and sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. He took Carter's hand. Carter's eyes opened more fully when he felt the contact. He looked at his father. He looked at the state of his father, the untucked shirt, the absent jacket, the expression on Douglas Ellison's face that Carter had never seen before and would not have known how to name except that it felt, against all probability, like his father was actually there. Really there. Not planning something else. Not managing the moment. Just there. "Dad," Carter said. His voice was hoarse and thin. "I'm sorry." Douglas Ellison tightened his grip on his son's hand. "Don't," he said. The word came out rough. "Don't you apologize to me right now." Carter looked at him. "You came," he said. He didn't mean it as an accusation. He meant it as a statement of something surprising and large. Douglas understood the distinction. That was what made it hurt. "I came," he said. And then Douglas Ellison, who had not cried in front of another person since his own father's funeral 11 years before, put his face in his free hand and sat there, holding his son's hand with the other one, and let himself feel what he had spent 14 years trying to manage instead of feel. Carter did not say anything. He just held his father's hand back. And the monitors kept their steady rhythm, and the light through the window turned gold as the afternoon aged, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was somewhere else. Patricia arrived from San Diego at 6:15. She stood in the doorway of the room for a moment, taking in the sight of Douglas and Carter, Douglas still in the chair, still holding Carter's hand, both of them quiet in the particular quiet of people who have said something important that doesn't need repeating. She was a sharp and perceptive person, and she understood immediately that something had shifted in that room beyond the medical crisis. She came in, kissed Carter's forehead, squeezed Douglas's shoulder briefly and without comment, and sat on the other side of the bed. For an hour, the three of them were together in that room, and they talked, not about the company, not about the custody schedule, not about logistics or plans. They talked about Carter. His interests, his feelings, his life as he was actually experiencing it rather than as the adults in it had assumed he was experiencing it. It was Carter who brought it up, who said, in the small and careful voice of a teenager deciding to trust adults with the truth, that he had been sneaking out on Saturday mornings for months because it was the only time he felt like himself. That he wasn't trying to be reckless. He was trying to breathe. And the two people who loved him most listened, and did not defend themselves, and did not make it about their own discomfort with what they were hearing. They just listened. That conversation, in a hospital room in Tucson on a Saturday evening in June, was the one that Carter later said changed things. Not the heatstroke. Not the road. The conversation. Because the road had put them all in a room together with no agenda, and the room had done the rest. The question of who had helped Carter began to surface the following morning. Diane Castillo had included in her incident report a notation about the first aid measures she had found in place upon arrival, describing them as appropriate and effective, and noting that the individual who applied them was a minor, approximately 12 years of age, no medical training reported. The hospital administrator, reviewing the report as part of standard weekend intake procedures, flagged the notation and mentioned it to the attending physician. The attending physician mentioned it to the social worker who had been assigned to Carter's case for the duration of his stay. The social worker, whose name was Andrea, had spoken to Roy Hendricks by phone on Sunday morning. Roy had left his number with the hospital when he brought Carter in case anyone needed a statement, and Roy had told her the whole story. By Sunday afternoon, Douglas Ellison knew the name Marisol Reyes. He knew she was 12. He knew she lived in a small community outside Tucson with her grandmother. He knew she had used 2 gallons of water from her own morning chore, the shirt off her back, and a rancher's cooler full of ice. And he knew, because Andrea had gotten it from Roy, who had watched the whole thing, that Marisol had not hesitated. Not for a second. He asked to meet her. Andrea reached Elena by phone on Sunday evening. Elena listened to the full explanation, who had called, why, what Douglas Ellison was asking, the nature of the request. She listened without interrupting. When Andrea finished, Elena said, "I'll speak with my granddaughter." She hung up, went to the back porch where Marisol was doing homework in the last of the evening light, and sat down beside her. She told her what the call had been about. Marisol listened, her pencil still in her hand, her notebook open on her knee. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Does he just want to say thank you, or does he want something?" Elena looked at her. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question." They went on Wednesday. A neighbor, a man named Victor who had a reliable truck, drove them to the hospital where Carter was still in recovery. He had been moved out of the ICU and into a standard room, and his color was better, and he sat up in bed when the door opened and looked at the girl who had kept him alive with an expression that was part gratitude and part something harder to name, a kind of recognition, maybe, as though he had heard a story about her so many times already that meeting her in person felt like encountering someone he already knew. Douglas Ellison stood when they came in. He was in his suit. This was automatic. The suit was almost a reflex at this point, but something about the way he wore it in this room looked different than the way he wore it in boardrooms. A little less certain of its own authority. He crossed the room toward Elena first, which was right. He had some instinct, or perhaps he simply looked at her and understood that this was the person to address first. He shook her hand. Elena shook his. Her handshake was firm and brief, and she looked at him with the direct, level gaze of someone who is making an assessment and is not trying to hide the fact that they are making one. Then Douglas turned to Marisol. He did what very few adults do naturally. He didn't extend his hand from a standing height and make her look up at him. He crouched down so they were at eye level. He looked at her directly. "I want to thank you," he said. Marisol looked back at him. She had known this moment was coming and she had thought about it on the drive over, and she had decided what she wanted to say. "I did what anyone should have done," she said. Douglas held her gaze. "Most people didn't," he said. "Most people drove past him." Marisol nodded. "I know," she said. "That's the part that bothers me." There was a pause. Douglas Ellison, who was accustomed to being the most certain person in any given room, found that he did not have an immediate response. Behind him, Carter made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Douglas stood back up and looked at Elena. "I would like to do something for your family," he said. "Not as payment, I understand there's no payment for what she did. But because I want to. Because I think it's right." Elena studied him for a moment. She was measuring something, not his wealth or his status, which meant nothing to her, but his sincerity. Whether he meant it. Whether he was here for a reason that would last past the moment. She seemed to reach a conclusion. "Her school has no science lab," Elena said. "She wants to be a doctor. She has wanted to be a doctor since she was 9 years old. There is no one in our family who has ever been to university. She doesn't know how to get there from where she is. That is what she needs." Douglas looked at Marisol. "Is that true?" Marisol looked back at him steadily. "I want to study emergency medicine," she said. "I want to work in communities like mine. Places where the clinic is far away and people have to make do with what they know. I want to be better at it than I already am." Douglas Ellison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." And he meant it in the way that people mean it when they have made a decision that they do not intend to walk back. What happened over the next year was not a single dramatic gesture. It was something more incremental and more real, a series of decisions made and kept, one after another, that added up to something significant. The first thing Douglas did was speak to the principal of Marisol's school, an underfunded middle school in a district that operated on a budget that would not have covered 1 month of catering for one of Douglas's investor meetings. He asked what the school needed. The principal, a tired and quietly determined woman named Ms. Vargas, who had been waiting for someone to ask that question for 9 years, handed him a list. It was 2 pages long. Douglas funded everything on it. The science lab. New textbooks for 3 grades. A reading resource room. A computer that actually worked. He did not make a ceremony of it. He did not bring a photographer. He sent the check, and the things arrived, and Ms. Vargas called Elena to say thank you, and Elena told Marisol, and Marisol went to school the following Monday and sat in the new science lab and ran her hand along the edge of the new lab bench and felt, for the first time, like the path she had always imagined was becoming a path she could actually walk. The second thing Douglas did was come back. This was the one that nobody expected, not Elena, not Marisol, not even Carter, who knew his father's capacity for follow-through in the professional domain but had less data on what he was capable of when the stakes were personal rather than financial. Douglas came back the first weekend in July. He brought Carter, who was fully recovered by then, tanned again, moving with the ordinary energy of a healthy teenage boy. They came to Elena's house and sat on the porch, and Elena served them food, and Douglas asked Elena about her knowledge of traditional remedies with the genuine and specific curiosity of a man who has encountered something that interests him and is not too proud to admit he knows nothing about it. He asked about the heat management protocols she had taught Marisol. He asked about the plant-based treatments she used. He asked about the community's relationship with the nearest clinic, how far it was, what the wait times were, what the most common untreated conditions were. Elena answered all of it. She answered with the directness of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated and has long since stopped performing modesty about what she knows. She knew these things. They were worth knowing. She told him. Douglas listened with the same focused attention he brought to supplier negotiations and board presentations, the full attention of a man whose professional success was built, in part, on the ability to identify what was genuinely valuable and pay attention to it. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, on a porch in 90-degree heat with a glass of Elena's horchata in his hand, something in Douglas Ellison shifted in a way that was quiet and permanent. He was not, as some stories would have it, a man transformed by a single afternoon into someone he had never been before. He was still Douglas. He still worked too much. He still answered emails at midnight and missed things that mattered and had a long way to go in being present with the people who needed him to be present. But he was beginning, genuinely and slowly, to understand what presence actually meant. And that beginning, in a person like Douglas, was more significant than it sounds. Carter and Marisol were awkward with each other for the first hour of that first visit. They were teenagers from entirely different worlds who had been connected by a circumstance neither of them had chosen, and the connection came with a weight that neither of them entirely knew what to do with. Carter knew, in the abstract, that this girl had kept him alive. He had been told. He had read the paramedic report that his mother had gotten a copy of. But knowing it abstractly and sitting across from the actual person were different things. He kept looking at her and then looking away. Marisol, for her part, found him less intimidating than she had expected but also somewhat puzzling. He seemed, for someone who had so much, to be very uncertain about very basic things. Like how to ask for something. Like how to say what he actually meant. Like how to just sit somewhere without checking if he was sitting correctly. These were not criticisms. They were observations. Marisol made a lot of observations. By the second hour, they were talking. Not about that Saturday, not directly. About other things. Carter asked her about her school. She told him about the science lab, and about Mr. Aguirre, and about the project she was doing on desert ecosystems for the regional science fair. He asked genuinely interested questions, which surprised her slightly. She asked him about his school in Scottsdale. He described it with a kind of flat accuracy that was funnier than he intended, and she laughed, and he looked pleased and then embarrassed at being pleased, and then they were both laughing, and after that it was easier. Carter came back the following weekend without his father. He hitched a ride with Andrea, the social worker, who was making a routine visit to the community and was happy to bring him. He helped Marisol's younger brother Daniel with a math worksheet he'd been struggling with. He sat with Grace, who was 6 and very interested in his sneakers, and patiently answered 30 consecutive questions about why they were so white and whether they glowed in the dark and how much they cost and whether he had ever dropped them. He ate dinner with the family, the first time in a long time. He said to no one in particular, that he had sat down for dinner with other people and not had his phone at the table. Elena looked at him when he said that. She didn't comment. But there was something approving in her silence. He kept coming. Not every weekend, sometimes twice a month, sometimes once. But consistently, across months, across seasons, in a way that was not organized around obligation or performance but around the fact that something real and good was happening in these visits and he did not want to stop having access to it. He helped with yard work. He listened to Elena's stories. He started learning the names of the plants on the windowsill. He brought books from the Scottsdale library system for Marisol, medical texts, science titles, whatever she requested, because her school's library was limited and the public library in the nearest town had a long hold list. He brought them without ceremony, just left them on the porch table when he arrived. She read them all. Douglas, in the meantime, had begun a conversation with his company's community health division, a division that had existed largely as a PR function, writing small grants to visible causes and taking the tax deduction. He began asking different questions. What were the actual gaps in rural health access in southern Arizona? Where were people dying from things that shouldn't be fatal, things that were fatal only because the help was too far away or arrived too late? What was the intersection between traditional knowledge systems like Elena's and the formal medical system, and was there a way to bridge them rather than dismiss one in favor of the other? These were not the questions his team was used to being asked. They adapted. 6 months after that June Saturday, Douglas established the Ellison Rural Access Initiative, not a PR exercise, not a line item on a donation list, but a structured, staffed, funded program designed to reduce the gap between rural communities in southern Arizona and emergency medical care. He brought Elena in as a formal advisor. She tried to decline the consulting fee. He declined to let her decline. She took the fee and used it to fix the roof of her house, which had been leaking for 2 years. He also did something smaller and less visible, which was to have a quiet conversation with Carter's therapist about what Carter had said in that hospital room, about the Saturday mornings, about breathing, about the need for space. The therapist, who had been working with Carter for 2 years and was neither surprised nor unfamiliar with what she was hearing, suggested that the solution was not for Carter to stop needing space, but for the people in his life to understand that the need was real and provide for it in a way that didn't require Carter to hide. Douglas, to his credit, heard this and did not defend himself. He went home and knocked on Carter's bedroom door and asked him if they could talk. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the fishing trip, which Carter still remembered with an accuracy that startled Douglas. They talked about what Carter wanted from his life, which turned out to be things Douglas could actually support if he knew they existed. And they talked about what Douglas had missed, not in the spirit of blame, but in the spirit of two people who care about each other trying to understand what went wrong and what could be different. It was the hardest conversation Douglas Ellison had ever had. It was the most important one. Marisol turned 13 in September. Elena baked a cake, a tres leches, which was Marisol's favorite, and the family ate it on the porch as the evening cooled and the stars came out over the desert in the particular abundance that is only visible far from city lights. Carter came. He brought the complete collected works of Dr. Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon and writer, which he had found at a used bookstore in Scottsdale and thought she might like. She read the whole thing in 4 days and then sat on the porch with Elena and told her every important thing in it, the way she always processed what she read, by explaining it to someone else until it was truly hers. Douglas sent a card. It was a brief card, a little formal, the way his cards usually were. But inside it, at the bottom, in handwriting slightly different from the printed message, slightly less certain, slightly more real, he had written, "Marisol, I hope this year brings you closer to everything you are working toward. You already know what you're made of. The rest is just time." Marisol kept the card. She put it in the same box where she kept the things that mattered, a photo of her grandmother as a young woman, a letter from Mr. Aguirre written when she won the regional science fair in October, a pressed flower from the desert that she had found the morning after a rain when the whole landscape smelled clean and new. The things that were real. The things that lasted. The regional science fair win was significant in more ways than one. Marisol's project, a comparative study of evaporative cooling techniques used in traditional desert communities versus the first response protocols recommended in EMT training manuals, had been selected not only for the regional level but passed up to the state level in November. The state panel of judges included 2 physicians and a professor from the University of Arizona's College of Medicine. The professor, Dr. Rebecca Moore, had read Marisol's written analysis and described it in her judge's notes as demonstrating a level of integrative thinking unusual for any student, let alone a middle schooler. She had also written, in the margin of her notes where she thought no one would see, "Find this kid and make sure she gets where she's going." Andrea, who had maintained contact with the family and attended the state fair, found the judge's notes when they were shared with the school. She shared them with Elena. Elena read them and folded them carefully and put them in her apron pocket, and that evening, after dinner, when the younger children were in bed and it was just her and Marisol at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the night insects loud outside the window, she took the note out and handed it to Marisol. Marisol read it. She read it twice. She set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Abuela," she said, "do you think I can actually do it?" Elena looked at her granddaughter. She looked at the girl who had walked a 2-mile road at dawn every Saturday of her life to bring water home. The girl who had knelt in 109-degree heat beside a stranger and done everything right. The girl who had turned that experience into a science project and won a state award with it. The girl who, at 13, was already asking questions that most adults never think to ask. "Marisol," Elena said, "the question is not whether you can do it. The question is who else you will bring with you when you get there." Marisol looked at her grandmother for a long moment. Then she nodded. And she got up and got a glass of water and sat back down and started making a list. That was how Marisol processed things. She made lists. She figured out the steps. She started walking. The years that followed moved in the way that time moves when it is full of work and intention, faster than expected, slower in the moments that matter. Marisol finished middle school with the highest GPA in her class. She entered high school in a district that was still under-resourced but somewhat less so than before, partly due to a state-level policy shift that Elena had, quietly and persistently and with Douglas's logistical support, advocated for over the course of 18 months of meetings and letters and one in-person testimony before a committee that she drove 3 hours to attend. Elena had never testified before a government committee in her life. She wore her good dress and her reading glasses, and she brought her notes on an index card, and she spoke for 4 minutes about what rural communities needed and did not have, and she was the clearest and most specific speaker the committee heard that day, and 3 months later there was a line item in the state budget that hadn't been there before. Marisol, who had driven to the Capitol with her, sat in the gallery and watched her grandmother speak, and felt something settle in her that she had not previously known was unsettled, a sense that the world could be moved, that the gap between what was and what should be was not fixed but was, with enough specific and patient work, crossable. She carried that feeling into every year of high school. She also carried it into every conversation she had with Carter, who was, by this point, less a connection born of obligation and more a genuine friend, the unlikely friendship of two people who had almost nothing on the surface in common and, underneath the surface, quite a lot. They texted. They talked on the phone sometimes in the evenings, Carter sprawled across his bed in Scottsdale and Marisol at the kitchen table with her textbooks open, both of them talking about their days with the easy rhythm of people who have earned each other's trust through honesty over time. Carter had taken up photography in his junior year, not for a class, but because he had started going out early on Saturday mornings again, with his father's knowledge and blessing now, and he found he wanted to document what he saw. He was good at it. He had an eye for the specific detail, the one thing in a landscape that made you feel what the landscape meant. He took a photograph of Elena's kitchen windowsill, the herbs drying in the sun, the small scratched jars, the light coming through the glass at an angle that made everything look deliberate, and it won a school photography competition, and he gave Marisol the print, and she put it on the wall of her bedroom where she could see it from her desk. She looked at it every morning when she woke up and every night before she turned the light out, and it reminded her of where she had come from and what she was carrying. Douglas Ellison was different too, not entirely, not in some clean redemptive arc, but in the ways that matter. He still worked too much. His assistant still spent a certain amount of time running interference between his schedule and his personal life. But he had dinner with Carter on Thursday nights, every Thursday, without his phone at the table. Not because it had been formally agreed upon, but because one Thursday he had turned his phone over without thinking about it and Carter had noticed, and something about the way Carter had looked, not surprised, not pleased, just quietly okay, had told him that this was the right thing and he should keep doing it. He kept doing it. He had also, in the 3 years since that Saturday in June, begun to talk about his own upbringing in ways he had never previously allowed himself to: the hardware store, the scarcity, the hunger to be more secure than his father had been, the way that hunger had consumed so much of the space that should have been his son's. He talked about it with Carter first, and then with his own therapist, and eventually with a small group of other business leaders he knew who were asking similar questions about similar distances in their own lives. He was not a man who found this easy. But he was, finally, a man who understood that easy was not the standard. Marisol Reyes graduated from high school on a Thursday evening in May, in the gymnasium of a school that now had a science lab and working computers and a library that had been expanded in 2 rounds of donations over 4 years. She walked across the stage in a rented gown, her name called by Ms. Vargas, still the principal, still tired, still determined, and she received her diploma and shook Ms. Vargas's hand and looked out at the audience from the stage. Elena was in the 3rd row, in her good dress, with Daniel on one side and Grace on the other. Grace was 12 now and wearing her first pair of heels, which she had practiced walking in for a week, and she was crying with the particular exuberance of a 12-year-old who does not try to hide her emotions. Daniel, who was 15 and trying to be composed about the whole thing, was also crying and trying to pretend he wasn't. Carter was there too, in the back row, camera around his neck, because he had asked Marisol if he could come and document it and she had said yes. He took photographs all evening with the careful attention he brought to everything he photographed now. Douglas was there beside Carter. He had flown back early from a conference in Dallas to make it. He sat in the back row in a button-down shirt without a tie, which was as informal as Douglas Ellison got, and he watched a girl who had been 12 years old and barefoot on a road 6 years ago walk across a stage with her whole future open in front of her, and he felt something that he did not have a word for except that it sat in the chest, warm and still, in the place where things that are genuinely good tend to settle. Marisol had been accepted to the University of Arizona, pre-medicine, on a full scholarship. The scholarship fund was a combination of sources: an academic merit award from the university, a state grant for first-generation college students in STEM fields, and a contribution from the Ellison Family Foundation that was structured, at Marisol's specific request, as a loan that she would repay by agreeing to practice medicine for at least 5 years in an underserved rural community after completing her residency. She had made this condition herself. Douglas had tried to make it a gift, no strings. Marisol had said no. She had said she wanted to earn it in the way that meant something to her, not by suffering, not out of obligation, but because the agreement made it real. Made it hers in a way that a gift, however well meant, didn't. Douglas had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "Okay." And they had shaken on it, and the paperwork had been drawn up, and it was done. Elena did not come to the graduation party afterward. She tired easily now, at 77, and the gymnasium had been loud and warm and she had squeezed Marisol's face in her hands at the door and said everything she needed to say with her eyes before going home with Daniel and Grace. But she had stayed up. When Marisol came through the door at 11:15 that night, still in her gown, shoes in her hand, Carter's photograph of her walking across the stage already on her phone, sent to her the minute he'd developed it digitally in the car, Elena was in the kitchen. The lamp was on. There was a plate on the table. Elena looked up when Marisol came in. "Eat something," she said. "And then tell me everything." Marisol sat down. She ate. And she told her grandmother everything, in order, from the beginning to the end, the way Elena had taught her to tell things. Clearly. Completely. Without leaving anything out. Because a story only has its full weight when it is told all the way through, to someone who is listening. Here is what we know now. Marisol Reyes is 18 years old. She starts her first semester at the University of Arizona in the fall, and she has already been in contact with Dr. Rebecca Moore, the professor who wrote that note in the margin at the state science fair 5 years ago, who is now her faculty mentor. She wants to specialize in emergency medicine. She wants to build a practice model that integrates the kind of traditional community health knowledge her grandmother carries with the formal tools of modern emergency response. She believes, And the evidence in that paramedics report supports the belief that the gap between those two things is smaller than the medical establishment has historically acknowledged. She intends to spend her career closing it. Carter Ellison is 16. He is a junior in high school, still in Scottsdale, still taking photographs on Saturday mornings with his father's knowledge and blessing. He has submitted a portfolio to 3 art schools for early review. His father has told him, clearly and without qualification, that whatever he decides to pursue, he will support it. Carter told Marisol that conversation on the phone the same night it happened, and Marisol had said, "Good," and Carter had said, "Yeah," and there had been a pause and then they had talked about something else, because some things don't need a lot of words once they are what they are. Douglas Ellison is still Douglas Ellison. He works too much. He misses things sometimes. But he is present in ways he was not before, and the difference, to the people in his life, is not small. The Ellison Rural Access Initiative has, in 3 years, funded 2 mobile health clinics serving 11 communities across southern Arizona, trained 47 community health workers in emergency first response, a curriculum that incorporates, formally and creditably, techniques derived from traditional knowledge systems, and reduced the average emergency response time in its service area by 19 minutes. 19 minutes is the difference between heatstroke treated in time and heatstroke treated too late. Elena Reyes knows that. She knew it before any of them. She knew it on a road in June, through the hands and instincts of a 12-year-old girl she had raised to pay attention. Roy Hendricks still drives that road every Saturday morning. He keeps a full cooler in the back of his truck, year-round, and he checks his phone for signal at the same spot where he found them that morning, as a reflex, as a habit, as the kind of small and private practice that people develop when something has reminded them that you never know what the road will put in front of you. He doesn't talk about that morning much. But when people ask him, he says the same thing every time. He says, "I've seen a lot of things on that road. I've never seen anything like that girl." And that is the truth of it. Not the miracle version, not the movie version where everything resolves into perfect clarity and everyone becomes who they should have been all along. The real version. The one where a 12-year-old girl walks 2 miles in the desert on a Saturday morning and comes around a curve and finds a boy who is dying, and she does not look away. She does not decide it's not her problem. She does not calculate the risk or the reward or the inconvenience. She just kneels down, and she does what she knows, and she does not stop doing it until the people with more resources and more equipment arrive and take over. And that act, that simple, grounded, costly act of refusing to look away, set something in motion that neither she nor anyone around her could have mapped or predicted. It changes what a father and son say to each other in a hospital room. It changes what a company does with its money and its reach. It changes what a community has access to. It changes what is possible for a girl who was already going to be remarkable and is now going to be remarkable with support. These are not small things. They are the kinds of things that look small from the outside and are in fact enormous, the turning points that don't announce themselves, that arrive in the shape of an ordinary Saturday morning, on an empty road, in the worst heat of the summer. Think about the person in your own life who did something like that for you. The one who stayed. The one who didn't look away. The one who showed up when you needed it and did not make you feel like a burden for needing it. If you have one, you know exactly what this story is about. And if you are still watching this, which means you have been with this story from the beginning to the end, then you already know that the most powerful thing a person can do is exactly what Marisol did. Pay attention. Stay present. Know what you know. And when the moment comes, because it comes for everyone, do not look away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your own life, or a moment when you either stopped or kept walking, tell us in the comments right now. We genuinely read every single one. And if you're new here, subscribe before you leave. Because the next story on this channel, about a mother who made a single phone call she almost didn't make, and how that decision protected an entire family 15 years later, is one you will not want to miss. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Stories like this one only matter when people like you are willing to sit with them all the way to the end.